Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have a special guest, a fellow native New Yorker, an author, historian, Peter Levenda, who's the author of Sinister Forces, and people who are going to be familiar here with the To the Stars, Gods, Man, War, Secret Machines series. So welcome, Peter.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, I've been hoping to speak to you for a number of years now. I've made like a bunch of different like memes or infographics with a bunch of your quotes, because I think that you often have these, like, I don't want to say they're one-liners, but you also have these quotes that really stand out to me, like, wow, like it's so brilliant, but it's so obvious kind of thing. You know what I mean?
I appreciate it. Great.
Yeah. So people listening may be familiar with the Secret Machines series with Tom Delong kind of put together To the Stars and recruited a number of interesting people. And you have been the author for the Secret Machines nonfiction series, which is Gods, has been out, Man, which recently came out in 2018, and War, which is due to come. So for people listening, how did you get mixed up in the whole mess of UFOs?
Well, I came in, like I tell people, I came in through sort of a side door on this, because I came across, while researching Sinister Forces, which was research that took place over more than 20 years, I came across some weird people, some weird individuals, when I was researching the Kennedy assassination, right, of all things. And I was looking not to do the typical conspiracy theory Kennedy assassination stuff, but I wanted to see if there was a deeper element to all of it, if we were missing something by trying to put our finger on one group or another. And I came across a guy called Fred Krisman, and he was being questioned by the Jim Garrison people down in New Orleans because of his possible connection to the assassination through the Minutemen or something, one of these right-wing militia groups. And there was this notation about Krisman having been involved in UFO stuff back in the day. And so I started pulling at that thread. And there's Fred Krisman in 1947 up at Puget Sound with a guy called Harold Dahl. And, this was like the first UFO contact of the modern age. Harold Dahl's on a boat with his dog and his son, and what appears to be a UFO is in distress. And it's raining particles down on the boat and kills the dog. Harold Dahl goes to his boss, who's Fred Krisman, and says, this weird thing happened. And between Krisman and Dahl, a story gets concocted. Don't know how true it is, how false it might be, but it's a UFO experience, and it's happening just as Kenneth Arnold is having his sighting over the Rockies in the same month, in 1947, in June, I think, 1947. And there are the flying saucers. He coins the term flying saucer. And then Kenneth Arnold then goes to meet Krisman and Harold Dahl, and a bunch of Air Force officers go and meet them. And this whole thing starts in 1947. And who's investigating this but a guy called Guy Bannister, who's with the FBI in the Northwest, and he's investigating UFOs for J. Edgar Hoover. And he's sending back telexes to Hoover called a special project or a special mission SM-X. And they're all X files, literally. And he's sending these telexes back saying, I interviewed this guy, I saw this UFO experiencer, and on and on. And he's reporting on all the UFO stuff. So that's in 1947. By 1963, when Kennedy's assassinated, we've got Guy Bannister in New Orleans with Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry, Jack Martin, the entire crew. Here's a guy who, with the FBI, was investigating UFOs. Now he's in New Orleans. And guess what? Fred Krisman is also being investigated for his possible role in the Kennedy assassination. I thought, this is too weird. What does the UFO phenomenon of 1947, which opened the floodgates because Roswell happened the following month, this whole thing is happening in 47. And yet some of the same individuals are now being investigated by the district attorney in New Orleans for their possible role in the Kennedy assassination. How do these things even get put in the same box. It doesn't make sense, right? So that started getting me involved in looking at UFOs seriously. Like, what is it about the UFO phenomenon that attracts people from all different walks of life, but politically also? I mean, there's this weird political undercurrent to the UFO phenomenon. And of course, we got that with Richard Doty and with, disinformation campaigns by the Air Force and all the rest of it. So, but I wanted to know if there was more to it than that. And as I wrote my book Unholy Alliance about Nazis, and that was really only intended to be one chapter of Sinister Forces, and it became a book by itself, I got contacted by Whitley Strieber. And I'm still living in Kuala Lumpur at this point. I'm in Malaysia. And I'm researching Sinister Forces. It hasn't been finished yet. Unholy Alliance has come out. Whitley's contacted me because he thinks there's a possibility that some of the experiences he's been having regarding the UFO experience, the alien experience, might have been possibly engineered by Nazi scientists at Randolph Air Force Base, which is where he grew up. And his father worked there, or worked with Randolph Air Force Base. And Randolph is the site where the Nazi scientists, the medical people, set up their shop under paperclip after the war. So you had Hubertus Strughold and all of these weird Nazi doctors, running an operation out of Randolph. And so Whitley is thinking maybe there's some connection there. And he had some memories of a specific person, an individual with a German name who seemed like he might have been a Nazi at the time. So all of this, so I started researching that. And of course, it got me into this whole rabbit hole of Nazis and UFOs and assassinations and all the rest of it. So I came into the UFO phenomenon that way. I was one of those people who read Communion when it came out, thought it was a great book. I'm one of the few people who loved the film. I thought Christopher Walken was great.
Yeah.
If you met Whitley and you saw the film, this is not the same person, but still, I thought it was pretty. It wasn't typecasting, but it was pretty good. I thought Christopher Walken was hysterical. So that was like my sum total of my background on UFOs until Unholy Alliance, and then people came out of the woodwork and started talking to me. What about the Nazi situation with UFOs? And I got into that. And in Sinister Forces War, when it comes out, there are chapters on the Nazi UFO thing as well, because that is a fascinating whole little section of history we really don't know that much about.
Yeah, I'm glad that you're including that, because that's something that I've really been curious about, and I'm skeptical in the sense where it's very interesting to me, but the stuff that's out there publicly available right now is questionable because of everything that goes with it. I don't know. There's so much out there that I don't have what I feel is a reliable source on it, and so I'm looking forward to what you're gonna put in there and source and everything. But I actually meant to get to this question much later, but you kind of have just brought that up with that whole thing. Is the MILABs, military abductions? What are your thoughts on the idea of like a military staged abduction? And another interesting kind of note is that Jacques Vallée had an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove, I believe in the 1970s, and Jacques is he's talking about psychological warfare, but then in one of his journals, I believe it's journal number 4, he's talking about that he secured a CIA document that's talking about staging UFO events in Brazil.
Right.
So that, and of course, Tom has talked about it several times, and I know that Tom DeLong and Stephen Greer do not see eye to eye, but when you have both ends of the spectrum both talking about the same thing, it makes it very interesting and curious, especially knowing that both people and groups had connections to inside sources.
Yeah. Well, to answer the question in the larger sense, I don't know anything more about MILAB's kind of stuff more than you've read. Probably you probably read more about it than I have. But that said, I did a lot of research on MK Ultra, behavior modification operations, Bluebird, Artichoke, et cetera, It's in Sinister Forces at length. So I was fascinated by that because it just blew my mind that a government agency would be so invested in understanding consciousness and trying to understand and manipulate consciousness and memory. That was like, the emperors of a couple of hundred years ago in Europe hiring alchemists and magicians, to find the philosopher's stone. And this seemed like the same thing to me. Here was a government investing money into the black box of consciousness, trying to figure it out. And how do we understand it? How do we manipulate it? So CIA did a lot of questionable things back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for sure. By the time the 80s ran around, it got so, because of all the exposés and because of, Dick Helms hemming and hawing in front of the Rockefeller Commission and everything else, all kinds of stuff was happening. And they clamped down, I think, on some of the more questionable stuff that they used to do. And there's a lot of lawyers now at CIA more than ever before, I think, just for that reason, because they were sued over the Frank Olson affair and all this other stuff that went on. So you had people being unwittingly dosed with LSD, for instance, as we all know. We had LSD being given to children in orphanages, and all kinds of wild stuff was going on as subcontracts to CIA. But we tend to forget that the US Army also did a lot of drug research on its own people as well. And they did a lot of questionable stuff in battlefield situations in Vietnam. For instance, during the Phoenix program and some of the other things, they experimented with all kinds of ways. So we know they have the capability to stage events. As far as the military is concerned, I'm not so sure about CIA anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's not on their list of things to do right now. But I think that the military, we know, as a matter of fact, Richard Doty from the Air Force was doing all kinds of crazy stuff, right? So he was infiltrating, he was spreading disinformation, and he's kind of proud of it for some reason. So he goes and does interviews, it's like, I would be bury my head in the sand, for that. But no, he's like kind of wants to talk about it, which is fine. But here we have an actual case of somebody manipulating the UFO community. And we're not really sure what the end goal was in this case. Was it just to discredit ufology? You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to destroy Paul Benowitz, for instance. You didn't have to go to do all these other things that you did. I don't know how the Air Force thought it was okay to go after U.S. citizens, and that's a major issue for me. So we know they do stuff like that. So is it so far-fetched to talk about a Mill Labs kind of thing, a military abduction of innocent civilians? It's a bridge too far, I think, but if we ever actually had documented evidence of that, that would be, I think, a major scandal for all kinds of reasons, not just for the civil rights aspect of it, but from the point of view of psychology and psychiatry, from the point of view of medicine, from the point of view of so many different other issues that I couldn't even begin to list them all. So that's my initial feeling about Mill Labs. I've had books on Mill Labs. I've read it. They seem, plausible up to a point. So I'm going to leave that open. That's something that we still have to look at. We've done a lot of weird stuff. We took in Nazi scientists under paperclip by the thousands. We did all kinds of stuff that morally it's kind of indefensible, but there you go. It is what it is.
Well, and kind of like what you were saying, it's what is reported in my labs. I mean, nobody has to actually be taken per se.
Right.
It could be a very MK Ultra type scenario
which is what Whitley thought it might have been. I mean, in his case, he was wondering if this was some sort of fallback from that kind of scenario. And to bring you up to date on it, and I brought it to date, I talked to Whitley about this some time ago. I don't know if he's talked about it, but I located the person he talked about finally after almost 20 years of searching. And I found the name and I found the guy and I found where he came from. And this was a German who operated out of a German school. I believe it was in Colombia, if my memory serves me right. That was closed during World War II for, I guess, obvious reasons. And then was reopened again much later. But he operated out of that school and then kind of disappeared, wound up in the United States, about where you'd expect him to be if he was at Randolph. and then disappeared again. And this was a guy who we don't really understand generally, the general public, but the Third Reich had a lot of operations around the world, not just in the battle areas, not just in the contested areas of the war in Europe, for instance, but they had a lot of people in Africa, a lot of people in South America. They had German houses, Deutsche Hausen in all the different major capitals. They were attached to the embassies there, and they were promoting Nazi ideology, and they were also being used as spies to penetrate the local military and political establishments. So there was a lot of pro-Nazi sentiment in South America, which I learned to my discomfort, shall we say, in '79 in Chile. So, this did exist. There was a wide circle of Nazi involvement. So you put the Nazis together with paperclip and with MK Ultra and hysteria over brainwashing coming out of Korea, and all of this together. And you've got a perfect storm of people, some very sane scientific people, some very sane military people mixed in with a whole bunch of crazies, and you couldn't tell the players without a scorecard.
Yeah. And kind of like an interesting note is that, when talking about UFOs and even UFO technology, in several threads, Werner von Braun's names comes up. So that's
sure.
Another.
Oh, there's no doubt. You'll read about it in War.
Oh, perfect. I'm really looking forward to that. But to shift back, more UFO centric in this regard, was there a turning point for you where the UFO, instead of being like an interesting thing that could be something, was like, okay, holy crap, this is a thing, like, for sure?
Oh yeah, I mean, there wasn't one moment. I became convinced of it when I started researching sinister forces, and I came across mountains of documentation on this. And I'm reading all this stuff, and I'm saying, well, we don't have to say it's aliens. We don't have to say it's extraterrestrials. We don't have to say anything. What we have to do is start from square one and say, this is a thing, right? This is something that's happening, and we don't know what it is. And what do you mean we don't know what it is? And the reason we don't know what it is because no one's telling us what it is, because they don't know themselves. And there's a political element to this, which is what fascinated me, which didn't really make it so deeply into sinister forces, but has in other work that I've done. And that is that the government cannot say it doesn't know what it is, because it loses legitimacy if it does. It's an attack on their own sovereignty. It's an attack on their legitimacy as defenders of our airspace. For the government to come out and say, well, guess what? We can't defend you from this. We don't know what it is. Nothing we do can stop it. We can't shoot them down. We can't control the situation. They show up when they want to. They leave when they want to. They have physical characteristics that we don't understand. They can shut off our nuclear plants. They can shut off our missile systems and turn them back on. There's nothing we can do. And for the government to come out and say nothing we can do means that their legitimacy as a government has to be questioned, right? At least under the old school ideas of what a government is, which is the organizing principle, as Donald Sutherland says in JFK, is for defense, right? If the organizing principle is for defense and you can't defend the country, then your organizing principle is shot to hell. So I got into it from that point of view. I'm looking at all the documents from the earliest stuff, going through Blue Book and all the rest, and I'm saying, how can you just say this isn't so? I read the Condon report, and I said, are you kidding me? Are you seriously?
Yeah.
And so any reasonable person looking at this says, oh no, there's a UFO phenomenon. We just don't know what it is. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking at it. It's real. And I was convinced of this, and I said, I've never seen a microbe. This is my usual argument, but I know microbes exist. I've never seen a UFO, but I know they exist. And then a couple of years ago, I saw one. So there you go, out the window. My old arguments don't hold water anymore. Now I become someone who's actually seen one. And I never expected to. I mean, I just thought this was a rare event for the billions of people on the planet. Why would I see a UFO? But it turned out that, I saw exactly that a couple of years ago in December, just before COVID. And I was driving home and I passed through the gate. It's a little gated community. And I passed through the gate and I see what I thought was a helicopter. And we get police helicopters, we get that kind of stuff, once in a while. But there was no sound, and police helicopters make a hell of a lot of racket. There was no sound at all. There was a bunch of lights in the sky right over the car. So I stopped the car and I looked out and I saw, triangular lights. And it took me that long to realize what I was looking at, because I'm still trying to think it's a helicopter. That's my first, it's got to be regular aircraft, right? And I'm looking at this thing, and then it takes off like that, disappears without a sound, with no wake, it's at night, so I don't see a wake, but it just disappears. And I suddenly think, shit, that was a UFO.
Yeah,
I actually
exactly.
saw it, and I had a camera. I could have photographed, I could have done something, but no, because my bodily reaction, my whole, physical memory thing is it's a helicopter. It must be a helicopter, even though it's not making any sound, even though it's hovering over your car, and then it just took off. And that was my UFO experience. So now I have to put myself in that category of somebody who believes in UFOs because he saw one.
Yeah, for sure.
Not because the evidence is overwhelming. Bummer.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you too about the idea of the secrecy. And I think maybe you're going to be addressing it in war, but
sure.
The idea of UFO secrecy and why, right? Why the secrecy? Is it? Do you think that, again, like you said, some of it is because they don't know what it is. But do you think there are also components of saying maybe they have been able to look at, examine and inspire technology based on possible recovered UFO technology, and or what other reasons would there be for secrecy other than they don't know?
Well, yeah, one big one. This is a global phenomenon. The United States has no monopoly over this phenomenon. It happens everywhere around the globe. Because we don't know what it is, we're afraid to reveal what we do know about it in case the Russians, the Chinese, anybody else has another piece of the puzzle, and they take our piece and they fit it together, and now they know what it is, and they can control the situation, right? Nobody knows what this is, but everybody has an angle on it. Everybody's had their missile bases affected by it. Everyone's had their aircraft affected by it. They've had their villagers, seen it. There's been eyewitness testimony. Everybody has pieces of this thing. And so we're secret. Our government is secret because they don't want the other people to know what we know or what we don't know. That puts us at a disadvantage. So it's almost better for the government to claim they do know what it is, or they do have more information, which keeps the other countries on their toes and keeps them off balance. I can see this as an intelligence game, but it's an unprecedented one because we're all talking about something that none of us knows anything about. And we're using the ignorance as kind of a weapon against our enemies, our adversaries. And I understand that that's why it would work and that's why it would happen. I also understand that it's probably not a very workable situation in the long run. The US has to, and every country, I think, has to get as many of their people involved in the analysis of this phenomenon as possible. It's important. And as I've said in other places, it's not just the scientists. The scientists, because they've grown up and been trained in a certain way, they're going to analyze everything from that perspective. We need somebody also thinking outside the box, maybe with a scientific background as well, like a Jacques Vallée, for instance, or a Hal Puthoff. We need people like that actively involved with the government people, with clearances, working on this problem as well, having access to the special access programs, the areas that we're not supposed to know about. But we need artists, we need musicians, we need painters, writers, we need people from the background of psychology, psych of every kind. Everybody's got a piece of the answer. And the secrecy is not doing us any good. We're going to have to kind of gird our loins and admit that nobody knows what this is, and we've got to put resources behind it. That's my personal feeling. I think that one of the goals of the Secret Machines project, and I think Tom would agree with me, was to do the fiction and the nonfiction. And the reason is to get everybody involved in the in the narrative. Try to understand this thing from the point of view of a narrative, and not just as a course you would take in college to get your degree, but something that involves you personally, gets you involved, gets you to think about it in creative ways, to see it in creative ways, and then to go to the nonfiction to see the foundational work that's been done so far. You know, the questions that people are asking in the sciences and in the soft and the hard sciences. So the secrecy is a problem. I think during the Cold War, it was a big problem. We didn't know what the Russians knew. We didn't know what the Chinese knew. There was a big problem that maybe they had an edge on this. Maybe these were Russian secret weapons. Maybe these were Nazi weapons that had been co-opted by the Russians, who actually got more scientists than we did under their version of paperclip. So all kinds of stuff could have been going on. And I understand that the secrecy reason during the time of the Soviet Union. But I think now we got to take a breath. Yes, Russia is still a problem, a potential threat. So is China a potential threat. Everything's a potential threat, but so is the UFO phenomenon. And we've got to come to the understanding of what this could possibly be. Tom talks about the threat aspect of it, but that's not being paranoid. That's just being pragmatic. Since we don't know what it is, we cannot unequivocally say this is not a threat. When it shuts down your missile bases, it's potentially a threat. When it interferes with your flights off an aircraft carrier, it is potentially a threat. They may not have intentions of being a threat, but they are a threat. Until we know what intentions are, we can't assume that they're friendly. And I understand that military intelligence approach. But we need simultaneously people taking a social sciences approach maybe to this, and a purely scientific approach to it, to analyze it, taking the threat out of it and trying to figure out what else it could be. What are they trying to tell us?
Yeah, that almost reminds me of that movie Arrival, where they're trying to communicate with the phenomenon.
Absolutely. I think that's yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned the SAPs, and you've gotten to speak to people behind the scenes. Do you have any kind of insights into the legacy programs at all?
No one's told me anything that's classified, right? I don't have a security clearance. I think I used to back in the day when I worked for Bendix, but that's a long, long time ago. But I don't have a security, so they're not going to tell me anything they're not supposed to, and they're very good about that. Believe me, they don't just sit there and talk about classified stuff. So I was in a meeting, and I was in a meeting with Hal and Jacques and Chris Mellon and Tom, discussing what we could discuss. And every once in a while, something would be brought up, and everybody would go dead quiet, except Tom and I were looking at each other like, what happened, right? And they're all sitting there looking at each other, the classified guys, the guys with the clearances, saying, well, we can't talk about that. So you begin to understand that there are, in the shadows, there's something behind there, which may be legacy programs, right? But you have no verification of this. You can't go out and say, yes, I can unqualifiedly say, no, everything is behind closed doors and locked up pretty tight. We would bring up Skinwalker Ranch, right, as an example, and then dead silence, right, on specific issues, right? Everything would go quiet. Okay, change the subject to something else. So, but what they were able to do, people with clearances, was guide us in the right direction. Just with have you thought about this? Or what about that? Or try to frame it in these terms without telling us anything, just to force us to think outside the box, force us to think differently. In the end, we don't come away with any classified information, but we do come away with an enlarged way of looking at a problem that we may not have had before. And that was helpful in writing Secret Machines, for instance, because the one thing it did to me was say, okay, there's all kinds of weird stuff happening out there. The government does know more about some of it than it's telling us, but what they know is probably not enough for them to make a decision about anything. They just have a lot of extra pieces. Yeah. One piece that came out because of the Nimitz affair, and it's something I've talked about before, so I hope I'm not boring anybody with this, but it's a thing that I still can't get my head around. I understand, the planes, we're seeing all of these Tic Tacs and all these globes, and they're flying all over them, and there's hundreds of them or thousands of them, depending who you talk to. and they don't know what to do about it. And they're trying to engage and they can't engage and all this other stuff. And that's really cool stuff. But at one point, they all kind of disappear. And then the planes are now supposed to meet at a preordained, I'm saying preordained, it's not really true, but at a calculated spot in space, right? In the sky, a CAP, right? Which is an access point where they're all supposed to converge at this place. But the computer generates that on board the aircraft carrier. It generates this set of coordinates and it by computer sends them to the planes. You're supposed to meet over there. The planes don't know where this point is until they get that message from the carrier. The computer generates it at that moment. The pilots are getting the advice from the carrier saying, you're not going to believe this, guys, but those things that you saw, they're waiting for you there. At that point that was just created by the computer moments ago. What the hell was that? How did that happen? I can understand we have some, aeronautical capabilities you don't have. We can go through space the way you guys can't. We can go into the ocean and not leave a wake. We can do all kinds of other fancy stuff. But how the hell did you know where we were supposed to be before even the computer knew?
Yeah.
That to me just made me stop and say, okay, we are dealing with something else here. We're dealing with something. I mean, even if they knew where it was the same moment, how did they tap into our computer systems? The most highly secure computer systems on the freaking planet. And they knew about it effortlessly and were able to wait for the planes at that spot. So we're dealing with something very, very different here. So whatever special access programs there are out there, whatever legacy programs there are out there, if they're not addressing this, they're not addressing the UFO phenomenon.
Right. And we can kind of speculate as to whether that was some kind of mechanical and or even consciousness or both kind of scenario there. Maybe, people have talked about technology assisted consciousness and consciousness assisted technologies, where there's an interface with technologies and consciousness. And I think that aspect, again, like you said, you can't really take out of the phenomenon itself, because even Dr. J. Allen Hynek, he had to create a term just to say, hey, this is like a part of it, which is high strangeness.
Right.
And it was a part of the thing, not an exception.
Right.
During these close encounters.
It's a feature, not a bug. Exactly.
Exactly. So, and I think that's something that, most of the community at this point is coming to grips with now in mass, especially the newer generations. And
Right.
I think part of that has to do with the ATIP slide 9.
Right.
And I did an interview with Lou and I ran down some of the categories of,
Yeah.
what slide 9 said and, cognitive human interface and
Mhm.
basically talking about what we would consider psychotronics. But
Yeah.
so that's a fascinating kind of portion of the phenomenon. So what are your thoughts on the UFO phenomenon when it comes to consciousness?
That's the ball game, as far as I'm concerned, because consciousness has to have preceded the technology, right? So if there's an alien technology which is far in excess of ours, far greater than ours, or far different, let's say, rather than greater, because greater, lesser is maybe a false dichotomy. Let's just say different. A kind of consciousness that's different from ours had to have created it, right? Now we could say it's us in the future, right? I've heard that explanation. Well, this is, we've evolved to the point where we can now time travel back into, the current time, and we're waving hello. Fine, but that means we in the future have a kind of consciousness that we in the present cannot comprehend. Or the only ones who can comprehend it are the shamans and the witches, right? And to use a term, the people who are making a career, essentially, out of penetrating the unconscious mind, of expanding consciousness, of trying to see things in different ways than we do. So these are the only people that are doing that, right? The religious and spiritual technicians using a spiritual technology. And I've written about this in other places. And I think that I go back after studying UFO documents and studying the news reports and everything else. Then I start going back, as I did in Secret Machines Gods, and saying, well, this awareness might have existed all the way back in the beginning of recorded history, that we humans knew there was something fishy going on out there, knew there was something else. And we began to create systems for trying to understand it and for trying to emulate what we had experienced. So I used the idea of the cargo cult was the thing that got everybody's attention when we started the Secret Machines project. That cargo cult initial section of Secret Machines Gods was printed kind of as a mission statement, as Tom called it, and he gave it to all of the people that he was talking to. And they got on board because of the strength of that, saying, okay, you're on the right track. The idea of a cargo cult is that, you know, people who are less technologically advanced see a much more technologically advanced civilization. They freak out and they try to imitate it, not understanding the details, not understanding the technology. They try to imitate the technology. So the cargo cults that existed in the South Pacific were people who had seen airplanes. They were Stone Age cultures. So they start building landing strips. They start trying to build towers. They're building equipment they think is going to enable the planes to land on their landing strip and give them all kinds of goodies. Our point was that we, as the human race, we are a cargo cult. That's who we are. That's informed everything we've ever done in science and in religion. It's been aimed towards these two twin concepts, immortality and space travel. Everything that we've done has been aimed towards those directions, getting off planet and living forever. And these are things that seem to have come down from the gods who came from space or from the sky or from wherever, showed up, talked to us, gave us some basic tools for technology, and then disappeared. And this seems to be a motif you find in cultures around the world. So our point is that maybe everything we've been doing has been a form of cargo cultism, that we're still unconsciously being motivated by this first contact that happened maybe tens of thousands of years ago. It's a consciousness process. And our consciousness has evolved to the point where we're now developing AI, we're developing all kinds of robotics, we're doing all of these things, including advanced propulsion systems in avionics and aeronautics, because we're still imitating the flying saucers we saw 10,000, 20,000 years ago. We're still trying to do that. And that's still this is the trauma that we experience, in a sense, that we're reliving with every scientific endeavor, every religious cult, every religious ideology that comes around. It's all based upon this element. So consciousness, to me, is the key factor to all of this. If we can figure that out, and we can't figure out our own, you know, we still don't know what consciousness is. We debate it. Is consciousness an emerging property of the brain? That's like the one big thing. Without a brain, there's no consciousness, and your brain creates consciousness. And I ask the opposite question: is, you know, the brain an emergent property of consciousness? You know, is consciousness and the brain, are they co-equal partners in this? Is the brain a receiving station for consciousness? On and on and on. You know, it's an effectual radio, so we have to tweak the radio to get more consciousness. So the UFO, to me, is a signal regarding consciousness. The close encounters people have been unsettling encounters with beings who don't look quite like us. They're not human. They could be humanoid. They could be cyborgs, androids, anything like that. There's mysteries about these encounters that cannot easily be explained. And I use the example of the sanitation engineer, the garbage collector. They have as much to contribute to this discussion as anyone else, because I think a sanitation engineer on board a UFO or having this experience of alien contact will notice a few things right away that the rest of us don't notice. And that is, there are no garbage cans on board a UFO, right? There doesn't seem to be anything involving waste materials on a UFO. There's no belching no belching by aliens or by non-human entities. There's none of this going on. What does that indicate to us? Are they inorganic, for instance? So let's proceed from there. Let's ask somebody like that, what would you expect to see on a spacecraft? Well, we've designed the International Space Station to take care of all of these problems, right? We've designed the space shuttle to take care of. We know that we have to deal with human waste material, whether it's a crumpled piece of paper or anything else. So we know we've had to take steps. How come there's no such obvious step aboard a UFO? Why do we always see UFOs as being pristine, shiny, a complete surface, no sharp edges, nothing that would betray its actual purpose? You know, there's all kinds of stuff that goes on with the experiencers that I think we should take seriously and analyze it and pay attention to it the way John Mack did back in the day when he realized they were all suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome to some extent. All of this should be taken seriously. And the problem was, in years ago, if you talked about consciousness or you talked about anything and you brought in the subject of UFOs, it devalued the conversation completely.
Yeah.
Just threw it out. Oh, you're mentioning UFOs, little green men, forget it, next, right? You were canceled, pretty effectively. For the first time in my lifetime, I'm seeing UFOs being taken seriously and people not being canceled because of it. People are still being canceled because of it, but that's in another group. But generally speaking, in terms of people in general, mass media, we are now starting to accept that this is a real thing. And the more we do that, the more we're going to start asking the right questions. Finally, after so many years of having contact, we can now start asking questions. We can now maybe get to the root of this problem in our own minds, because it's our minds that have blocked us from understanding what this is.
Yeah, for sure. And I heard you mention in another interview a quote from Hynek talking about the interpretation being, not the thing itself.
Right. Yeah, the interpretation is just, an interpretation. It's not what you're interpreting. Exactly, right.
Yeah, and I think that's a key point. But getting to some of the things you were saying, and obviously, nobody can know this for sure, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on, we use the term the phenomenon to point to a specific kind of set of phenomena, right? So what are your thoughts on maybe a singular intelligence versus the UFO phenomena, possibly being phenomena, several different intelligences engaging with humanity?
Well, it's speculation, right?
Right.
And I've heard otherwise, reasonable people very seriously try to convince me that there are multiple alien races and that there are these different groups and they come from these different areas and they're sometimes in conflict with each other and on and on. I'm thinking, how do we possibly know this, right?
Right.
If it's coming from experiencers, again, I would not take it at face value, but I would try to understand why. Why are we saying this? What is the rationale behind it? And how much collective agreement is there on these things? And who came up with these names, right, for these different groups? How did that happen? And on and on. Try to understand it, because it may betray something deeper, that we're using different races as a screen to filter through something which is much more complicated.
Yeah. Well, and even to the idea of like, somebody might have a UFO encounter, right? And then the same individual may have what we would consider some kind of spiritual encounters with a non-physical entity, right? And sometimes these things get thrown together. And I mean, there's no right or wrong, right? We don't have a taxonomy or a way to navigate that, because it's all in the unknown. So is it possible that some of the UFO phenomenon is a non-physical intelligence, or what people would call like an angelic, right? Like a spiritual entity. And then again, this stuff kind of gets mixed in and it makes it really hard to determine anything. So what are your thoughts on that? Even like a physical phenomenon versus, and or with the inclusion of a non-physical intelligence engaging with us as well?
The problem for me is defining terms, right?
Right.
So when people talk angels and demons and gods, and they talk aliens and, things like that, we really don't define the terms. We all think we know what we're talking about, but we're all talking across purposes. Because what's in your head about an angel might be in my head something different. And someone who's experienced what they claim as an angel, what they say is an angel, is going to have a very different, interpretation than we do. In the Middle East, there's the jinn, and this is an ancient pre-Islamic idea that there are beings that live among us that we simply cannot see under ordinary circumstances, but they're a race, and they have children, and they have, and they cohabit sometimes with humans, and you can convert them. There are jinn who've become Muslim, right? So I mean, there's this whole concept that we don't have in the rest of the Western world about these invisible beings that live among us, with us, that I think Hal, if I'm not mistaken, referred to as ultra-terrestrials, right? They're not extraterrestrials, they're not terrestrials, they're ultra-terrestrials. They live in a kind of another realm of being on this planet that we kind of share a little bit, but not consciously. But if we train our consciousness, we can become aware of these beings. Now, are these the same beings that are piloting UFOs? If UFOs are piloted, who knows? Until we start addressing the UFO problem, we can't really address the other problem. We've got to address all of this at once. That's the problem, addressing the nuts and bolts and the consciousness thing at the same time. And that's what seems to be so difficult. But I look at it from another way. We have to come to a common sense of what our definitions are for these things. In Secret Machines Gods, I implied, I think many times, that our experiences of gods, angels, and demons might be mask memories of encounters with the other, whatever it happens to be, whether it's an alien or whatever you want to call it, this other thing. And that these might be just ways of fine-tuning human experiences, different cultures perceiving this singular other through a different lens, a different cultural linguistic lens. So that's entirely possible. I can't speculate more on this. I know that people do have supernatural encounters, which they then come back and say, I don't know if I've seen an alien or a demon, right? And within the government today, the United States government, this problem still exists. And this is what is so unsettling for the rest of us, is that there are people within the government who resist studying UFOs, who resist funding it, who resist supporting it, because they think it has to do with demons. In the US government in the 21st century, there are congressmen, I'm not making this up, you can look it up online, and I've talked about it in a number of my books. These are people who actually literally believe that investigating UFOs is the same thing as investigating demonolatry, and that it's, if you're a Christian, you can't do it. And we have this entire, construct to deal with actually in the government. And we have some of that in the Air Force. The Air Force, which has gotten very strange in the last 20 years or so with religious instruction and everything else out there. So I don't know where we're headed on this, but there is a resistance to studying UFOs, and it's based on religion. So maybe they're understanding something we don't know, or maybe they're just more paranoid than we are. But so to answer your question by not answering it, this is what we have to deal with. This is why we can't get to an answer to this, because we have people involved in government, people elected by American citizens in a supposedly scientific age, that are afraid of UFOs because they might be demons.
Yeah.
This is where we're at.
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is, of course it's there, right? The phenomenon is there, and avoiding it's not going to make it go away. That's been proven at this point.
Sure.
They try to avoid it and hide it from the public, and it's only increased, if anything.
Well, and to get back to one of your other points too, one of the reasons, that for secrecy, the reason that secrecy is so bad, the phenomena is there, it's not going anywhere. We can put our heads in the sand and pretend it's not there, but this is something that's affecting us anyway every single day. I mean, it's out there, and the the memories of it now are part of our collective consciousness, right? We're getting the message slowly but surely that the UFO phenomenon is real, and it's sitting in there, and it's percolating. And we see more news reports, and there's more reports on news stations, and people talking about it very soberly. And they're telling us, yes, these things exist, and they're there, and they're working on us. So these memories are there, these ideas are there. They're restructuring us in a way. They're enabling us to be more open-minded about it, to be more aware that these things are happening. And as this happens, as we begin to embrace the UFO phenomenon as a real phenomenon, it may lead to us embracing other things as being real as well. But one of the problems about the secrecy, until recently, was that you could have a lot of charlatans in the UFO community claiming all sorts of things without fear of ever being challenged, simply because the government and academia and the intelligence agencies and the military would say nothing about the UFO phenomenon. Since they weren't contradicting them, anybody could say anything. So you had people coming out and claiming all sorts of weird stuff that could not possibly be verified by any normal means. And they would just go on and on about this. When Tom came out with Secret Machines and with the To the Stars project, that scared a lot of these people, because now it looked like the government was actually going to come clean about the UFO phenomenon. And if that happened, the charlatans would be out of work, right? Because now they're coming out and saying, this is what's happening. Yes, there are UFOs. And here's some videos of them. And here's Lou Elizondo talking about it, or here's Chris Mellon talking about it. So it's everybody's, suddenly now the fantasies that they were spinning for years, for decades, now they had to choke it back and maybe redirect their energy somewhere else, because now you have government people coming out and saying, yes, Virginia, there are UFOs. And there was so much pushback from the UFO community for a while against Tom and against this whole thing. And Chris Mellon, for instance, very famously tweeted out once, when are they going to take yes for an answer?
Yeah.
We're telling them it's true, guys. Throw away the tinfoil hats. It's true. There are UFOs. There's documents. There's videos. We know there's UFOs. And I should know. I was, Under Secretary of Defense. Here's Lou Elizondo, who worked for ATIP. All these things are coming out. They even did an X-Files season, a late season, where ATIP is mentioned on Fox Mulder's cell phone, right? I mean, it became the pop culture and the reality joined, meshed, and it's still meshing, and it's in ways that people are having a hard time understanding. And I think the pop culture now doesn't know where to turn, because now UFOs are real. Guess what? Now what do we do? What do we do with all the alien movies? What do we do with all this other stuff, right? Because now it's coming out true. If we're going to make a movie about UFOs now, we better do what we know now is true. We better adhere to the facts now that are being revealed and not get too far afield. So these are things that are going on. And the secrecy was bad, because not just bad for us in general, because we couldn't find out what the UFOs were, but it was bad for the UFO community too, people who sincerely wanted to know what the UFOs were, because you had people talking about all kinds of crazy stuff and being believed, because there was no one to contradict them.
Yeah, and I think, that's part of like this big kind of thing now, right? Is that for 70, 80 years, the people were told there's nothing to see here, it's not real. And even in 2009 and 10, there were inquiries of people putting together petitions to ask the president about UFOs. And I mean, I think the problem with that is I think they use the term extraterrestrial, which of course they don't know anything about extraterrestrials.
Right.
So that gave them a plausible deniability.
Sure.
But even back then, they're saying, no, we don't know anything about it. And here we go. Lou comes out and
10 years later,
I ran the program. It's real. And now nobody knows what to do, because I think that the deeper issue there kind of is people's even psychology, right? Of like, the authorities told me so, and now they're telling me otherwise.
Right. Well, that's a problem for sure. And that's led to, I think, some of the current problems we're having in this country today.
Yeah.
It's something that's been preoccupying me for years now. is the fact that we're now, since the government lied to us about UFOs, now they're telling us the truth. Did they lie about everything else, right?
Yes.
And that's always been, the conspiracy theorist mindset is the government's always lying to you. And that becomes a problem for government. And I think it's a really good lesson, and I hope somebody up there is listening, that the UFO secrecy thing did not help, right? What it did was it contributed to, in a long-term kind of way, to the gradual deterioration or the undercutting of democracy, because now we question all the institutions, right? So now you can have a phenomenon like there's people gathering at Dealey Plaza expecting that John F. Kennedy is not really assassinated and John Jr. is still alive and they're going to come back, right? Because why not? Because they lied to us about the Kennedy assassination. So they lied about everything else, right? Which is, it's a natural human reaction. I get it. I understand it. But as somebody who's been working in this field for a very long time, in the conspiracy field and looking for Nazis around the world and all the rest of it, I know there is a line between truth and falsehood, and there is a line between facts and fantasy. And I understand it's really hard to find that thin line when all you have is a smartphone and Google, but it is possible. I guess there's just a kind of a training and critical thinking that you need. But this secrecy has led to this. The secrecy about UFOs is part of the problem. And we had the Watergate, revelations, and then we had the assassination stuff in the 1970s, where the congressional subcommittees were revisiting. And they actually came out, Congress, and said, there's probable reason to conclude that John F. Kennedy was assassinated as the result of a conspiracy. They came out and said it. And then that just died and everybody forgot about it. So there's been a lot that's come out. We've revealed secrecy. But institutions have tried to be better. They've had a lot more lawyers to deal with. They've had a lot more lawsuits to deal with. But that doesn't mean they're coming clean on everything. And because of that, and because of the UFO thing, well, I'll give you a personal reaction. I went to a number of Contact in the Desert things. I was invited to talk a few times. One time because Jim Mars was too ill to make it, unfortunately. And I began to realize that the largest cohorts that would show up at these UFO events were kind of politically very right-wing. And that, to me, was kind of a revelation, because back in the day, if you were interested in this stuff, you were definitely on the left, right?
Yeah.
Because it was the left that questioned everything. It was the left that said, who really killed Kennedy, right? It was the left that asked all these questions because they didn't trust the authoritarian government. So now suddenly it was the right wing questioning, and they were questioning UFOs, and they were against the media. And when the New York Times article came out in 2017, there was a huge pushback from the UFO community. No, they're lying to us. Wait a minute, they were lying to you when they said there were no UFOs. And now they're lying to you when they said there are UFOs. Pick one, right? So, but that's the kind of mindset we've created, though.
Right.
We've contributed to this kind of thing, and that's really, really dangerous.
Yeah, it's a kind of cognitive dissonance in mass.
Yeah, big time.
And this is kind of like an adjacent street, but I did want to ask it before I forget. Was there a conversation or talks for To the Stars, maybe, or maybe even for you and some colleagues, for both when the Wilson Davis memo kind of hit the streets or the internet, so to speak, and or when it was put into the congressional record?
Yeah. The Wilson Davis menu, as you know, has been a bone of contention for a while. There have been people who said it was false, it wasn't true. There were others who claimed it was 100% true. In private conversations I've had, I've gotten this impression that the Wilson Davis memos refer to a real thing, but that the memos might have been faked. Like it was engineered to reveal the Wilson Davis conversations and contacts. And it was not disinformation, because that would mean the information was false. It was just a kind of sleight of hand. Like they were dumping a document like like the magic files, the Majestic 12 files.
Right.
Same reaction. People said, no, the MJ12 files, they're false documents, but they refer to a real thing. You know, and the Wilson Davis memo, initially, that's what I heard. The memo was fake, but the Wilson Davis thing was real. You know, the contacts were real. So that's the impression that I got, that there's somebody out there creating documents like the MJ12 documents. And, you know, I was fooled. I spent a lot of time at the National Archives researching a lot of strange stuff. And I've seen a lot of, you know, old documents, and those MJ12 documents look pretty real to me. Somebody went to a lot of trouble to fake those if they were really faked, and for no reason, you know, not for financial gain, obviously. They just went and faked them and then, you know, dumped them. And it's like, who would do this? What's the purpose of this? Why create this idea? Unless you're trying to tell us something, unless it's, you know, unless there's a greater operation involved, some sort of, you know, a mind control operation or something. Why go to all that trouble, you know? But there's been a lot of very learned, you know, analysis of the document saying it must be false. Some learned analysis saying, yeah, but not necessarily. And was there a Majestic 12? I don't know. But those people existed, and some of the connections were there, and we could kind of come around to thinking maybe there was something like it, but not necessarily the way the documents portrayed it. Right. Same with the Wilson Davis memo. That's what I've heard. The memo may be questionable, but the actual events were true.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about that is that the memo for the Wilson Davis was in circulation just at the end of the NIDS run, the National Institute for Discovery Sciences, and I don't know how much is out there publicly, but you know, a few of those members had the memo back then, and we know it came out of. So it was, the memo itself was at least created back in that time,
right?
And was circulating, and some people saw it, including journalists and researchers, as Richard Delong came out and said he was showing like 2 pages and you know, 2009 or so, and then finally they surfaced. So yeah, it's a very interesting one. So it's interesting to hear maybe what the To the Stars and you had heard, but kind of in that same vein, so to speak. What was it like for you, you know, when you saw and heard about the WikiLeaks thing? Because, you know, we had heard Tom talking about these stories, and, you know, everybody was kind of like, didn't know what to think, right? It's like Tom DeLong, right, is talking about UFOs. And I know I became convinced that something was serious when he posted like an Instagram picture of him and Podesta, and I was like, okay, because I know, you know, the researchers will know that Podesta has been involved with this, and he even spoke in 2002 at the National Press Club talking about how people need to know the truth about this. They should. That's the law. So when I saw that, I was like, okay, there's something going on. And then he's posting pictures at NASA, and I'm like, okay, there's something here. And funnily, you know, funny enough, and this comes up again and again, but it has to be stated, you know, Tom DeLong had a relationship with Stephen Greer, and there's kind of been this whole thing going on for decades, really, of people not in government connecting with government insiders, and the truth being put out in this way. You know, Grant Cameron, I mean, it could be a controversial kind of perspective on it, but I think there was some accuracy in what he was talking about in his book Managing Magic, with the idea of UFO messiahs. And again, not messiahs, but representatives that are civilians that are connected to government insiders who are trying to put this out in a way with some kind of plausible deniability. So what was it like for you when the WikiLeaks thing hit?
Well, I was there for that Podesta meeting, right? So I was able to ask him a couple of questions that I was interested in, you know, various things, and try to get him to go on the record about Hillary and UFOs, but he wouldn't. But then I asked him about, you know, signals intelligence versus human intelligence and all kinds of other arcane stuff. But eventually, you know, when Tom contacted me, initially, it was before all this happened. And he had been involved in studying UFOs for a long time. So he would have known Greer. He would have known a lot of people in the UFO community because he read everything. He was wealthy enough that he could, afford to indulge himself in, talking to people and flying here and flying there. And he had entree, in a sense. He had, because of his celebrity. So he was able to go and talk to people and get into places where the rest of us could not. So before all this happens, he comes to me and he says, I think it was at the end of 2014. And he says, this is what I want to do. I want to get to the bottom of this thing. I want to create, openness. I want people to start talking. I want to go to the government. And I want to go knocking on doors, and I want to get people to talk. And he said, basically, the only way to do this is not to go and attack them. This is the gist of the conversations we have, which extended over a long time. But my distillation of the conversation was, to be adversarial is not going to get us anywhere. And the UFO community is very adversarial against the government for obvious reasons. But, the government sees people like UFO people and they shut off and they say, okay, we're the enemy. They're going to start shouting, Roswell, Roswell, like in the X-Files episode, right? So no, we don't want to do that, right? We want to go and just politely say, listen, tell us what you can. Look at what we're doing. If we're off base, tell us to go away and leave you alone. We'll understand. But you see, Tom had connections, through, Hollywood kind of connections, and he had government kind of connections, and he had, I guess, military connections. His family, I think a brother was in the military. So he understood the way the military thinks. He had respect for them. And that was a major thing, because a lot of UFO people just automatically disregard CIA and the military. It's all one big thing. It's all Washington. It's all deep state, and it's evil. Tom didn't have that approach. So he was able to go in and start doing this. And so we found ourselves, he had a list of, like he says, 10 advisors. I didn't know all of them. I knew most of them, I guess. And I saw a lot of the communications between, and I would analyze it with Tom, and we would go and ask other questions. A mountain of stuff that we were working on in 2015, of which Podesta was just one aspect. And so we went through and talking to a lot of other people, and all of that's going along fine. And then WikiLeaks happens in 2016, right? Up until that point, everybody was thinking that Tom is just full of it. He's just making stuff up. He's just an egotist. He's just bragging about things he doesn't understand, doesn't know. He's a Johnny-come-lately to the UFO community from their perspective, although he had been involved with it for his whole life. But he was not part of the community, quote unquote. Therefore, he was an outsider. So go away. It's just noise. He's just bragging. He has nothing to show for it. And then WikiLeaks happens. And the good thing that came out of WikiLeaks was, oh my God, he was telling the truth. All this time, Tom was telling us the truth. There are actual, advisors. And there's Podesta, he was one of them. And then the other generals, some of them were revealed. And a lot of other stuff came out, and everybody's going, oh my God. And then Grant Cameron, one of the first ones, is out there trying to do an analysis of all of this. And he's putting up photographs of the generals and trying to analyze their backgrounds and how do they fit in with the UFO thing and Podesta and all the rest of it. And so he's, everybody's trying to figure this out at a time when we had radio silence. Tom unplugged everything. I had no communications with Tom except through intermediaries. We changed our phones. We got, encrypted email, encrypted phones, everything else, locking the barn door after the horse was gone. But we're still doing all this, trying to, do damage control the best way we can and to slowly rebuild what had been begun. And Tom, right after this enormous setback in 2016, a year later is able to go in front of everybody and say, here's Lou Elizondo, here's Jim Semivan, here's Chris Mellon, here's all these guys. We're creating a new approach to the stars. And, we're writing all these books and all this other stuff. And he just did it, right? I mean, within 12 months, everything was back on schedule, even better than before. How the hell did that happen, right? So yeah, Grant Cameron's going to sit back and people like him are going to say, oh no, this is all engineered. This is all, some deep state Machiavellian thing. We're putting this guy out there to take the heat. But what happened actually, right? I wrote the first book, Gods, which came out before WikiLeaks, if I recall correctly. And the second book would come out after. And he did what he said he was going to do, Tom. Everything happened the way he said it was going to happen. But what really happened was there was an article in the New York Times in December saying, by Leslie Kean and her co-authors, saying UFOs are real and there's a government agency, that does this. We knew Elizondo. Elizondo quits the government and joins Tom's operation, right? But this is kind of after the New York Times article comes out. So I don't see the manipulation. I don't see grounds for thinking there was some grand effort to create this concept, because who benefits then in this? Who's benefiting really? We forced government to open up a UFO office, basically. We forced them to come clean about what they know about UFOs, at least to the extent we can force them. We've got bills passed in Congress. All of this is happening. Was it because of Tom? Really? He paved the way. He made everybody start thinking about it. The shock value of WikiLeaks actually probably worked more in our favor, as I look back on it now with the benefit of years, than at the time it seemed like a tragedy. So, is it really so cut and dry that there was a government cabal that said, we're going to push Tom out there, he's going to take the heat, and we're going to see where this lies? I think it was Tom's energy. Tom is an extremely energetic, forceful personality. And he went everywhere and knocked on doors and, got everybody on board as best he could. Won some and lost some in the process. But still, it was his dream since he was a kid. So who manipulated who? How did this happen?
Well, and if you want to talk about that, I don't want to get too conspiratorial or meta, but what aspect of the phenomenon is also instigating a disclosure of its own sorts, of its own design?
Okay, I lost you a little bit.
Oh, sorry. I was saying,
that?
yeah. I mean, in a larger picture, what maybe aspect of the phenomenon is designing some of these,
Well, that's a different story.
Out.
Now you're onto something. Now you're onto something more, because if you read Sinister Forces, you understand my mindset on this thing is that time is not linear. That things can happen in the past, things can happen in the future, which will influence things in the past. I mean, there's been a lot of weird stories about that, and Sinister Forces is full of them. But the point is, it's not the deep state, which I don't particularly believe in, that's actually doing all this. And it's not, some cabal of intelligence agents who are masterminding this. It's something much deeper than that. As I said about the Kennedy assassination, and as I said about a lot of things that happened in American history in particular that I'm familiar with, there were presentiments of things that happened, long before the things actually happened. And there were things that happened, today that we can see traces of it in the past. This is the kind of thinking that scientists hate. And believe me, I feel you. Academics hate this as well. I understand. But still, I have a feeling that if anybody's orchestrating anything, it's the phenomenon that's doing the orchestrating. It's not some cabal of military generals or intelligence agents, maybe operating through them in a way or manipulating circumstances in such a way. But it's not an intent from where we're pointing fingers. No.
And again, that kind of goes back to slide 9, talking about the phenomenon being able to influence policymakers and/or individuals as being a concern. And again, the Nimitz was one event, and Lieutenant Ryan Graves has said there's daily encounters. So it's almost like the phenomenon is like poking at us, to address this.
And what has happened in the last 100 years that would account for this increased visibility? For the first time, we've gone into their territory. We were never able to fly until the Wright brothers. We had balloons, that was about it. But now we can fly. Not only that, we've landed on the moon. So we're now in their territory. I call it the kingdom of the sky.
Yeah.
We've now invaded their area. And we've got, if you ever look at the maps of what planes are in the air at any given time, the thousands of planes that are in the air at any time, given moment, any moment of any day, we're up there. we're all over the place. So maybe previously they took their time, they showed up once in a while, they said hi, they took off. Now it's much more frequent because we're much more frequently in their face. If that's where they live, if that's their territory from their point of view, they had control of it for thousands and thousands of years or much longer, who knows. Now they're not so much in control of it anymore. Now they got to deal with us, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's part of what's going on.
And there seemed to have been an instigation regarding atomic and nuclear assets.
Yeah, sure.
You know, that have seemed to really increase activity.
Yeah.
And you know, even Lou Elizondo and my friend, the Hermetic Penetrator, has written articles on UFO baiting and, you know, coaxing the phenomenon through nuclear assets.
Well, the Russians, the Soviets in the old Soviet period, they claimed to be able to do that. There are Soviet documents, and they're in the third volume, Secret Machines, where, you know, they went out and they began to learn how to summon or force a UFO to appear at the military bases. They just had to get very active, moving shit around on the military base, moving missiles and stuff like this, and then suddenly it would appear.
Can you expand a little on that?
Without taking away from potential sales from book 3?
Yeah, this is considered a promotion. This is an advertisement for everybody who's going to go out. Everybody watching this is going to go buy Secret Machines War.
Yeah. Okay. Well, some Soviet documents were declassified, were revealed, and generals went public with this as the Soviet Union fell, and people started feeling loose, and they started talking about this stuff. Now that lid is clamped back down again. But for a while, I mean, even at the end of the Soviet Union, even the last couple of years, Jacques Vallée was able to go out there and like interview people who had seen aliens in parks. So, you know, that was happening. And then as the Soviet Union fell, generals who were in charge of nuclear bases would come out and say, yes, we began to learn how to attract the UFOs to the base. We learned that they were interested in anything having to do with our nuclear missiles. So if we got very active in moving the missiles around on the base, just carting them from one area to another, doing anything like that, we could eventually have them show up. And then we learned how to gesture to the UFOs. And we would make a gesture. We would put our hands this way, and the UFO would kind of move in that direction. And we would gesture in another direction, they would move in that direction. Then they would go center, and then they would disappear. So they were able, they claimed, to actually, number one, summon a saucer of some kind, a UFO. And number two, to kind of communicate on a very basic, almost close encounters of the third kind level, you know, with the five tones.
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and it was happening in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and so do you know if U.S. intelligence picked up on that via the Soviets, or if the United States had possibly prior to that, or even after, say with like Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest, or you know, or the dozens of incidents in the United States had picked up on that?
Well, they had to have been aware of it. I mean, we monitored nuclear missile bases all around the world. We obviously monitored the Soviets like crazy. So we were constantly overflying with satellites and everything else, keeping an eye on it. Who knows if we have data from those events, right?
Right.
If we had satellites watching that and recording what was going on, we may have, you know, UFO footage that we didn't know we had if we were to go back and look at that, right? Because now we know where the bases were. I mean, that's been revealed. It's in Sinister Force. It's in the Secret Machines, rather. So, you know, it's not a mystery, but I imagine that a lot of that information had to have filtered through to our intelligence people, whether it was CIA or US, you know, Air Force intelligence or whatever, or to one of our partners and got to us. How was it handled? How was it treated, right? Did they say, oh my God, that's Russian disinformation. They're trying to make us crazy. They want us to go out and wave at lights in the sky. We're not going to do it. We're scientifically minded, you know, we're not like those Russians. Or, you know, we're going to, you know, we have enough problems with our missile bases being shut off and turned on, you know, by UFOs. We really want to go out there and agitate them, you know, and get their attention more. Who knows what policy decision was made at that level? I think it was not a scientific decision that would have been made. It would have been a policy one. Let's not cause any problems. Let the Russians do that and see what happens. Maybe they'll self-destruct, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the UFO goes and blitz them with a ray or something, and
Yeah.
so let's hope that happens, right? We'll just stay very quiet here and pay attention to ourselves. So who knows, right? And then the Chinese were not that forthcoming, but the Chinese were also involved, in the possibility of communicating with UFOs, and that led to Falun Gong, and that Chinese religious organization that is sort of responsible for some of the Chinese ballet acrobatic stuff in this country. It's an organization called Falun Gong, which still is a spiritual kind of process that involves something like Tai Chi and yoga, and it's a spiritual thing. But more than that, when you get deeper in Falun Gong, it's about contact with alien forces and about the UFO phenomenon.
Oh my
And the
God.
Chinese government has suppressed it completely because Falun Gong was getting enormous. I mean, there was getting thousands and thousands of people, and they would be, gathering in the streets and doing their sort of Tai Chi exercises and stuff. And it was becoming a potential threat to the government, and the Chinese government.
Okay, this is news to me, and that's absolutely fascinating. And as somebody who has practiced yoga and similar qigong and things like that, in my own experience, that helps and augments the process of contact.
Mhm.
So where could somebody find information on that? I'm gonna have to put a link in the description because that's a fascinating.
There's lengthy. I mean, it's all over the internet. So it's spelled. Well, it's pronounced Falun Gong. It's spelled F as in Frank, ALUN, one word, and Gong, GONG. Just
Okay.
go and look at Falun Gong. They've been tremendously suppressed in China, but more for political reasons than anything else, because they were becoming a kind of a government within a government. And there were many government people in the Chinese government that were members or followers of Falun Gong. So
yeah,
the traditional CCP guys are going, oh, wait a minute, what is this? And the UFO aspect of it is very real. And I talk about that in Secret Machines, obviously, because I do a lot about China as well. And look at China. I mean, their space program, their rocket program, their silkworm missiles, all of that goes back to a Chinese scientist who lived in the United States, who went to JPL, to the Jet Propulsion Lab, was one of the co-founders, basically, of the Jet Propulsion Lab, along with Jack Parsons, right? The infamous Aleister Crowley following rocket scientist who blew himself up in Pasadena back in '52. And he was part of the same crew. He gets fingered as being a communist agent, which he was not. And eventually, he's under house arrest for a while. Then he just leaves and goes to China, where he jumpstarts their space program, jumpstarts their missile program. He's like one genius that goes there and does it all. But he's fascinated by Chinese medicine, by Qigong, by the capabilities for psychokinesis and telepathic powers, and he starts promoting this heavily, right? So here you have the space guy doing the magic stuff simultaneously, like Parsons was doing in the States, and like some of the Nazis were doing. So you have this weird, collection of things that go together. We don't really appreciate or understand the connection between this advanced science on the one hand, rocket science, literally, and people who were rocket scientists who are also in consciousness big time.
And what's that guy's name? Do you recall?
With the Chinese scientists?
Yes.
Xian. It's spelled differently depending on how you look it up. His family name is Xian. Old fashioned is Tsien, but the more modern way of spelling it in China is with the Q, Qian. If you look up that guy and look up just JPL and Xian, and you'll find out who he is. You get massive.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that's, again, if we're going to kind of be contemporary, Diana Pasulka's book, American Cosmic, and this gentleman, Tyler D, who, everybody kind of knows who Tyler D is now. But Tim, and the same thing. He's a rocket scientist, engineer for NASA, and he's somebody who's having these contact experiences. Did you ever meet him, Tyler D or Tim?
No, not at all.
Have ever spoken with him at all?
Nope.
Yeah. But again, he's this guy who has had these contact experiences.
Yeah, I've heard of him, but I haven't spoken to him or seen him.
Yeah. So that's another fascinating, thing. And allegedly, this in the space program, there's more individuals like this.
Well, sure, there were, and eventually even people like Werner von Braun and some of the other German scientists we brought over, they had these unusual interests as well. Werner von Braun thought that Jack Parsons was the cat's meow. I mean, they were in communication long before World War II had broken out, when Parsons was just a teenager. And he's writing letters to Werner von Braun about rocket fuel and things like this. This is when we're not fighting a war yet. And they're communicating because they both want to go to the moon. I mean, their desire was space travel. So Parsons is talking about space travel to Werner von Braun. And then, of course, the war breaks out and there's no more communication between Werner von Braun and Jack Parsons. But Xian, oddly enough, the Chinese scientist, is brought to Germany in the last days of World War II. We're still fighting the war in Europe. He goes out there, I think, in March or April with Theodor von Karman, who's the head of most of our space program research at the time, to debrief Nazi space scientists and rocket scientists captured from Peenemünde and Nordhausen. So here's a Chinese scientist who is considered to have the highest security classification, to go with our top space scientist, Theodor von Karman, whose name is legendary. They go together to Nazi Germany, to the embers of Nazi Germany, to talk and interview all of these Nazi scientists. They come back from that trip, and Theodor von Karman goes to General Pap Arnold and says to him, we have to do what the Nazis did. We need to have our own Peenemünde. We need to have our own total war footing and do exactly what they did, because what they did was remarkable. They were going to win the war if we hadn't stopped them. And they were very close to developing an atomic bomb and all the rest of it. And the rest of their technology is amazing. And we got to get on the same footing in this country. We need a military industrial complex. And Theodor von Karman was the spiritual, father of that. But the Chinese guy then, our Dr. Xian, very famous guy, very well known in the field, then gets suspected of being a communist during the McCarthy era, right?
Yeah.
Well, you're Chinese, you must be a communist.
Yeah.
And he was nowhere near being a communist, but they arrested him and they closed him down from classified stuff. And here was a guy who had exposed to everything, to the Nazi stuff, to our stuff, to Jack Parsons and his crazy, spiritual pagan stuff, everything. And then he goes over to China and says, okay, cool. I can do here what they were doing over there.
Yeah. Wow.
He screwed up as usual with this kind of material because we don't respect it enough. And we didn't respect Xian enough to understand that he was not by any stretch of the imagination a communist or pro-communist. He was just a Chinese guy, He was just, his parents he was born in China. He came to this country to study and,
Yeah. And kind of where I wanted to leave this conversation off was with the occult and contact, because, you bring up the occult or, occult studies, the mystery schools, and there's all types of ideas that are similar to contact with non-human intelligence, whether you're talking about John Dee and Nokian magic or what have you. So what, and again, I'm somebody who's interested in contact and what people call human initiated contact or HICE, human initiated contact events, or we can call it CE5. There are different kind of terminologies that are all pointing to the same kind of thing that is not really modern by any means, but it's come to us in a new light and framework based on, modern thought, right? And the last few decades, because there was Mission Rama, who was doing contact work in South America in the 1970s, where they were going out doing meditation and concentration and having these incredible UFO encounters. So what are some of your insights into the occult and contact with UFO intelligence or even non-human intelligence?
Well, I write about it in Secret Machines, Gods, of course. I think that the occult is a technology in general, is a spiritual technology. It's a technology for these experiences. Religion in general is a moral framework. People feel, they feel spiritual. They get their high from that once a week, maybe, or something. The occult is much more a determined approach that takes place, on a daily basis, basically. It's a lot of study, a lot of practice. There's a lot of ritual involved in some cases of the occult. There's meditation involved in other cases. But all of these things are designed to create altered states of consciousness. But in the case of the occult in general, magic in particular, although it's an altered state of consciousness, which is one way of looking at it, you're also trying to create events in the physical world as well. You're trying to create things that are happening outside of yourself. So you're interiorizing, you're internalizing a lot of what you observe about nature. You're trying to understand it, correlate it to yourself, find insights, and then externalize it. It's a reciprocal relationship with the real world. In religion, you're sort of praying to God and hoping that God saves you and doesn't burn you up or something, send you to hell or whatever. In magic, you're taking a more proactive role. So you're trying to involve yourself in the process, but you have to use some of the same tools. You have to do the consciousness manipulation is part of it. You're trying to do certain things in rituals that focus the mind and basically banish things that are not part of what your present goal happens to be, your intention is. So you're trying to throw all kinds of energy and concentration behind that. I hate using terms like energy, but what am I going to do? You know what I mean? So these are practices which are very intensive, and the experiences that you're talking about that these people had through meditation, they get a UFO experiences. Is the UFO experience a screen for some other experience? Or is the religious experience the screen for a UFO experience, right? Are they the same thing, but one being a cultural component more than it is a thing in of itself, which sounds like Immanuel Kant or something, but trying to get away from the Hegelian, frameworks. But is it a thing in itself? Or, oh my God, now we're going to get lost. But anyway, my point is, these are real things that people experience. And they're doing it through processes that we call occult. That's one of the boxes we're going to have to get out of. That once we've acknowledged that there's something to the UFO phenomenon, that it's real, that it exists, we have to now look in that one box that we've forgotten to look in, that the scientists have forgotten, the religious studies scholars for the most part have forgotten, the psychiatrists hate, the psychologists despise. We've got to go into that box marked occult because there's a lot of useful stuff in there. There's things that there's understandings of how the mind works and how the mind-body connection works and how the mind-body world connection works that we need to go back and revisit because it's in that box. And that's what we need to look at without going into too much detail.
Yeah. And like a few thoughts on that is, it would be, the occult or magic could be seen as an old form or an attempt at the science of consciousness and being able to actually utilize what we call consciousness, take advantage of it in a sense, or again, utilize it. But something I guess it would be considered occult almost is Rosicrucianism. And I think in it was like Secret Machines Gods, and it was like a journal or something that was attached to the actual book. I think of yours, it had notes
mine,
that
it's my handwriting, which is illegible.
It was very hard to read. No, I'm kidding. But Hynek and Vallée were both either Rosicrucians or interested in Rosicrucianism, which is very mystical as far as compared to Freemasonry or something that is more heavily Western, the ideas in Rosicrucianism are very, they're talking about meditation, astral projection, psychic phenomena, and the energies and the aura and stuff, which it would be considered, I guess, very occult.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
and so just maybe thoughts on that. And also, I thought it was very relevant that you had included in the Secret Machines Gods the mention of the Merkaba, which is a very almost like sacred spiritual practice that is, in modern New Age thought has been talked about as like the ultimate vehicle or gate to ascension and other realities is the Merkaba. So between any of what I just said, you can comment on that. I'm sorry, I just had to unload that before I forgot.
Well, no problem. Yeah, and one of, I think it's his first diary, Vallée mentions that he had belonged to the Rosicrucian order for a while. And he told me face to face, he says, I don't belong in any Rosicrucian anything anymore. But I think it was part of his thing. He was, this guy's trained as a scientist, but he wanted to understand not just the UFO phenomenon, but occultism and these different secret societies and groups. They all seem to have something to say about it, right? I don't want to compare myself to Vallée, but it's basically the same impulse, right? That we both have for studying both the scientific aspect of these things, but also the religious and occult and mystical aspects, because we think they're all talking about the same experience, the same processes. So he's no longer associated with them. And of course, there was a while when other members of the To the Stars group were accused of being, well, Tom, I think, was a Freemason or is a Freemason. I mean, he's had photographs taken with Masonic apron. Who else? I think Hal was a Scientologist for a couple of years in the late 60s or something, around the SRI period or something. I don't think he is anymore. So they've all looked at these things, all of these different secret societies and cults and things, because of the desperation to find out what they may know. What did they find out? What did they happen upon in the course of all these weird, experiences that might be of value? So yeah, I get it. The Rosicrucian Society, AMORC, which I think is the one you're talking about, like the Rosicrucian Society based, I think, in San Jose, in California, is one. And yes, there's a heavy, concentration on, astral projection and the psychic phenomena and all of that. And as for the Merkaba stuff, well, I studied Jewish mysticism for my degree. So I've got very deeply involved in reading the Zohar and the Sefer Yetzirah and a lot of the other, Jewish mystical texts. The Daniel Matt translation of the Zohar is highly recommended if you can get to it. It's like, what is it, 12? It's 12 volumes long, but it's the absolute best investment you'll ever make in time if you're interested in the Kabbalah.
Yeah.
But Merkaba stuff was a fascination of mine. I wrote about it in Stairway to Heaven, which is a book that I wrote based on my master's thesis. And I expanded it, to include other things. But I was fascinated with Hechalot and Merkaba mysticism, which is this idea of a chariot that you go down to the chariot, which is the expression, they went down to the chariot. And then they ascended on the planes, the mystics, to the seven heavens. There's a parallel to that in Islamic mysticism as well. And then in Stairway to Heaven, I show there's a lot of different parallels in different religions and groups around the world having the same idea. There are 7 stages that you go from the earth to the heavens. The shamans in Siberia, the same thing. So there was this constant idea that there's 7 levels and you reach the top level and you attain enlightenment or immortality or whatever the goal happens to be. So yeah, all of this stuff may be correlated to the UFO phenomenon in ways we don't yet understand, and we won't understand until we start taking all of it seriously.
Yeah, and is that the 7 levels? Would that be akin also to like the 7 chakras as well?
Sure. A word of caution is the 7 chakras is only one chakra system. There's
right.
like
Yeah, absolutely. There's an 8 chakra and a 13 and 64 and
But the idea of the basic 7 chakra system, sure. I think that it's related. And I've when I wrote a book about Thomas Vaughan, the alchemist, I tried to show that Chinese alchemy and Western alchemy were based on the same principles, and that there's a body star connection with all of this. So I tried to show the idea of rising on the plains from a Chinese alchemy point of view, bringing the nectar up to the forehead and then dripping down and
Right,
opening your
right.
eyes and having enlightenment. Thomas Vaughan was writing about the same thing, in European alchemy during the reign of the Stuarts. So, I mean, it's weird, but almost
Yeah,
identical phraseology. So
yeah.
people were talking and thinking the same way.
Well, that's similar to like the Kriya Yoga, the spinal breathing, or again, if
Yeah,
we're going to talk about the word energy, circulating the life force through
right.
the body, nervous system, and maybe gaining access to other sense reality that you wouldn't be able to compute otherwise, or what it may be.
Sure.
But and I don't want to put you in a corner as far as like your interpretation and literal sense of some of the things, but as far as like Merkaba and some of those other ideas and philosophies, I mean, how do you interpret that and look at that, and in the modern day with a scientific framework, trying to be in a way that you're trying to be understanding, if that makes sense? And the possibility of accessing other realms, or even psychic perception, or anomalous mental phenomena, as it was called in some of the study documents.
The whole point of these spiritual technologies is to make you aware of how the world outside of your senses operates. We as humans are constrained in a sense by our senses. We have 5 basic senses. And we've done everything we possibly can to extend those senses. We've developed telescopes so that we could see stars. We've extended our vision out into outer space. We've extended our hearing through the telephone, the humble telephone, that we can talk to anybody on the planet. We're doing all of these things to try to extend our reach as much as we possibly can. We're hitting a brick wall, because there's only so many machines you can invent to see further and further. Now we have the telescopes out there. We're looking at the beginnings of the universe, and we're still not sure why we're here or what we're up to, what the whole purpose of all this is. So we have to realize that our senses, the common 5 senses that we're familiar with, are a limit to our understanding. They're a limit to our consciousness. We have to extend ourselves a bit outside of the reach of our senses to see into other ideas, other possibilities, to maybe create different machines that are going to be based on different paradigms of interaction with the outside world, the world outside of ourselves. So all of these things to me are valuable. If you take a scientific attitude towards them, if you record observations, if you repeat experiments, if you try to understand how the experiences you're having affect you personally, but also how they may be affecting the world around you. What do these experiences mean? There's a whole world out there that the occultists knew, and we sort of make fun of them for it. If you read the D. and Kelly, you mentioned Enochian, if you read the D. and Kelly books, the workbooks that they had on talking with angelic forces and all the rest of it, it is mind-bogglingly complex, and at heart mathematical and linguistic at the same time. It's almost impossible to understand how these things could have happened. And people want to say, well, they made it up. Yeah. Try doing this, try duplicating that effort, without using computers, without using AI, without using anything else. Start from scratch like they did, with an empty sheet of paper, drawing squares and filling in those squares, and create this enormously complex language system, a mathematical system, and a system for summoning spiritual forces. I mean, it's incredible, right? And that's what they were trying to do. And they were trying to do it through a little piece of glass, a little piece of obsidian, volcanic glass that they got from Mexico, that maybe the Aztecs had used for their visions because of their god of the smoking mirror, Tezcatlipoca. So there's this kind of a way of looking into the glass, of seeing like a crystal ball, and the angels would show up and would painstakingly go number by letter, square by square, trying to communicate these vast mysteries to them. I challenge anybody to go back and look at the Dee and Kelly workbooks and come away with an immediate understanding of what they were all doing, of what that was all about. Because, man, no, it's not going to happen. So this was based on what? This was based on a concerted effort by Dee, who was the mathematician of his time. He translated Euclid. The first translation of Euclid was John Dee's. Here was a guy who was a mathematician first and foremost. He understood about making maps. He worked for Queen Elizabeth I, and he's spending all of his time and resources, like the United States did with MK Ultra, right? Trying to penetrate the mysteries of reality, the mysteries of consciousness, trying to contact the angels, talk to God. Here was a guy putting it all on the line for that, and came away with these elaborate systems that we're still trying to understand. So that's my answer. We need to keep doing stuff like that. We need to take away the blinders from our eyes and not look at occultism as a kind of crank occupation. And let's face it, there's a lot of cranks in occultism, and there are a lot of gatekeepers in occultism, and you get dismayed immediately. Ignore all of them. Just go to the sources themselves. Try to figure it out step by step, what these people were all about. You'll be fascinated. You'll be amazed. And by practicing some of these things, you'll open up your mind to become aware of things around you you were never aware of before. The alchemists and the magicians always said, your teacher is nature itself. Nature is going to instruct you into what is behind nature, to that realm of reality behind it that causes it to grow and function. You'll be able to understand what that is, and that's very important.
Yeah, and that's almost very maybe not intentionally, but very similar to the Vipassana, where you're kind of observing the nature of reality, and you gain insight into reality by observing reality, in a sense. But
you really can,
Peter,
if you look.
Yeah, right. I could talk to you for like 10 more hours easily, but I know I got to let you go here. It's really been an honor having you on, and I definitely hope to speak to you again soon. But before you go, would you have any kind of parting words to the audience and to the people watching and listening?
These days, I've been quoting a character from Hill Street Blues. The cop at the very end, the end of the morning briefing, always used to say, "Be careful out there." And I think that's probably my parting words. These days, between the UFO phenomenon, between politics, between God knows what going around the world, there's all kinds of stuff happening. Be aware, open your eyes, but be careful out there.
Yeah. So thank you again so much for coming on. And I guess Secret Machines War, there's no ETA on that?
I have none.
Okay.
I have
I
no
know
ETA on it.
Yeah, Tom said, I don't know, I think maybe it was Tom who said, that, or during a To the Stars briefing or something, that the films are coming out and they're going to release everything maybe in the order that they think it should be released. So, I'll be anticipating that, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Fair enough. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter. Take care.
You too.